The South China Sea does not escalate. It accumulates. Every incursion that goes unanswered becomes a precedent, and every precedent becomes a boundary, and every boundary becomes a claim, and eventually the accumulated weight of all those unanswered incursions sits on the surface of the water like something that was always there. Permanent, geographical, inevitable. The United States Navy understands this dynamic precisely, which is why it sends carrier strike groups through these waters on a schedule that is deliberate, visible, and non-negotiable. At 7:22 a.m., the non-negotiation was being tested. The USS Carrier Strike Group had been transiting the South China Sea on a southwesterly heading at 18 knots for 11 hours, conducting what the operational orders described as a routine freedom of navigation operation through international waters that the People's Republic of China had formally claimed as sovereign territory through a series of administrative declarations, artificial island constructions, and diplomatic assertions that the Permanent Court of Arbitration had ruled invalid in 2016, and that the People's Republic of China had rejected that ruling with the same confidence it had deployed in making the original claims. The strike group's presence in these waters was not accidental and was not casual. It was a legal, deliberate, and documented assertion that the United States did not recognize the Chinese claim and would continue to operate in these waters in exactly the manner that non-recognition required. The People's Liberation Army Navy had been tracking the strike group since it entered the South China Sea 31 hours earlier. This was expected. Planned surface combatants routinely shadowed American strike groups in these waters, maintaining visual and electronic surveillance at distances that ranged from professionally respectful to deliberately provocative, depending on the political temperature at the moment and the instructions the planned surface group commander had received from the theater command in the hours before the contact began. The political temperature at this moment was not what any professional on either side would have chosen. At 7:14 a.m., 8 minutes before the situation became acute, the strike group commander had received an intelligence update from the CAOC that characterized a change in the behavior of the two planned Type 054A missile frigates that had been shadowing the strike group on the northern bearing since 4:30 a.m. The Type 054As had been maintaining a steady distance of 22 nautical miles, inside visual range of the strike group's helicopter assets, outside the zone that American operational doctrine characterized as immediately threatening, in the specific geographic middle ground that planned surface commanders had learned to occupy during shadowing operations. At 7:09 a.m., both frigates had altered course simultaneously, closing their distance from 22 nautical miles to a bearing that the strike group commander's Combat Direction Center computed, as the maneuver developed, would place them directly ahead of the carrier's current course line at a range of approximately 11 nautical miles if both ships maintained their current speed and heading. Not alongside, not astern, ahead, on the course line, in a position that the carrier group would either have to alter course to avoid or maintain course and accept a geometrically uncomfortable passage between two armed planned warships in a part of the ocean that China claimed as its own. The strike group commander had been in the United States Navy for 33 years. He had conducted freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea on 4 previous deployments and had been shadowed by planned surface units on every one of them. What he was watching develop at 7:14 a.m. was different from anything in those previous experiences. The Type 054As were not positioning to shadow. They were positioning to block. The distinction was operationally and legally significant, and the 8 minutes between 7:14 a.m. and 7:22 a.m. were 8 minutes in which the commander and his staff computed, assessed, and prepared for a situation that the operational orders did not specifically address in the language that the specific geometry now required. At 7:22 a.m., the two Type 054A frigates reached their blocking positions. They were at 11.3 nautical miles ahead of the carrier, oriented beam-on to the strike group's course line, not bow-on, which would have been an overtly confrontational posture, but beam-on, which presented their full profile to the approaching strike group and placed both ships' weapon systems in an orientation that was neither threatening nor accommodating. They had matched their speed to the strike group's 18 knots, which meant they were maintaining their position relative to the carrier rather than closing further. The geometry was precise and professionally executed. Both frigates were flying the national flag of the People's Republic of China from their masts, which was standard practice and was also, in the context of this specific situation, a deliberate visual element of what was clearly a deliberate maneuver. The lead frigate transmitted on Channel 16, the International Maritime Distress and Calling Frequency, at 7:23 a.m. The transmission was in English, delivered in a measured professional tone that was inconsistent with improvisation and consistent with a prepared statement that had been drafted, reviewed, and approved before the frigates had left their last anchorage. United States Carrier Strike Group. This is People's Liberation Army Navy warship on bearing 017. You are approaching waters under the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China. You are directed to alter course immediately and exit the sovereign waters of the People's Republic of China. Failure to comply may result in defensive measures being taken to protect the territorial integrity of the People's Republic of China. The strike group commander listened to the transmission. He had the International Maritime Law Assessment from his judge advocate on his desk before the transmission had finished. He had already known what the assessment would say. These were international waters under every applicable legal framework except the one that China had constructed for its own purposes and that no institution the United States recognized had validated. The waters were not Chinese sovereign territory. The strike group was not obligated to comply with the direction. The direction itself was legally without foundation. What the legal assessment did not address was the operational reality of two Type 054A frigates at 11.3 nautical miles ahead of the carrier on its course line, each carrying a HHQ-16 vertically launched surface-to-air missile system with an engagement envelope that extended to 70 kilometers, a YJ-83 anti-ship missile battery of 8 cells, and a crew of 165 personnel who had received orders from a command authority that had just publicly declared the strike group's continued course as a provocation to which defensive measures might be applied. The commander made his response decision at 7:24 a.m. He transmitted on Channel 16. People's Liberation Army Navy warship. This is United States Navy Strike Group. We are operating in international waters in accordance with international law, including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We will not alter our course. We call upon your vessels to maintain safe seamanship and to avoid any action that could lead to misunderstanding or miscalculation. Out. He then directed his Combat Direction Center to set the strike group's air defense posture to heightened readiness, activated the Cooperative Engagement Capability that linked the fire control systems of every ship in the strike group into a single integrated air and missile defense network, and vectored the two A-18F Super Hornets that had been holding a combat air patrol on the eastern, bearing to reposition north, placing them between the strike group and the planned frigates at an altitude of 15,000 feet. The Super Hornets repositioned at 7:25 a.m. Their presence at 15,000 feet, radar systems active in search mode, was visible to both planned frigates on their own radar displays and was designed to be visible. They were not threatening. They were present, a physical expression of the same statement the commander had just made on Channel 16. At 7:26 a.m., a third plan contact appeared. It had been there since before 7:22 a.m. The intelligence update that the commander reviewed at 7:27 a.m. established that the E-2D Hawkeye orbiting 60 miles east had been tracking it since 7:18 a.m., characterizing it as a surface contact consistent with a planned Type 052D destroyer moving at high speed on a southwestern bearing from a position that had been beyond the Hawkeye's optimal detection range at the start of the engagement. The Type 052D was a more capable ship than the Type 054As. A guided missile destroyer with a 64-cell vertical launch system, an active electronically scanned array radar, and a weapons suite that significantly exceeded the frigates in both range and payload. It was at 34 nautical miles to the northeast, closing at 26 knots. The geometry that the Combat Direction Center computed from the Type 052D's track was specifically uncomfortable. At its current speed and heading, the destroyer would arrive at a position northwest of the strike group in approximately 78 minutes, a position that, combined with the two frigates already ahead on the course line, would place planned surface combatants in a three-point geometric formation around the carrier's northern and western bearings. Three-point geometry with armed surface combatants was not shadowing. It was encirclement. Partial, incomplete encirclement, but encirclement in architecture, if not yet in execution. The commander reported the Type 052D contact to CENTCOM at 7:28 a.m. and received acknowledgement at 7:31 a.m. CENTCOM directed the strike group to maintain its current course, continue asserting freedom of navigation rights, and avoid any action that could be characterized as initiating hostile contact. It directed the strike group to maintain full defensive readiness. It directed no offensive action and expressed no change to the commander's existing rules of engagement. The operational guidance was to hold the line without providing a provocation that could be used to justify escalation. Holding the line at 18 knots toward two armed frigates at 11.3 nautical miles required mathematics. At 18 knots, the carrier would reach the frigate's blocking position in approximately 37 minutes. 37 minutes in which the planned formation would either move, maintain position, and force a navigational confrontation, or do something that nobody on the strike group's staff had yet modeled because it had not appeared in the previous 4 deployments and their combined database of planned behavior in these waters. The electronic warfare officer noted a change in the planned frigate's radar emissions at 7:33 a.m., the Type 054. A's had been conducting their own search radar sweeps since they reached their blocking position, routine for surface combatants in an operationally active posture, and the frequency and pulse characteristics had been consistent with surveillance mode throughout. At 7:33 a.m., the lead frigate's radar emission changed. The pulse repetition interval increased. The beam width narrowed. The change was small and required the EW suite's passive analysis system to run 3 successive correlation cycles before reaching a confidence threshold, but the assessment at the end of those 3 cycles was specific. The lead frigate's fire control radar was in a mode consistent with target designation, not a weapons employment preparation in the traditional sense, but an active radar activity that was technically a precursor to the employment sequence for the ship's anti-ship missile battery, not aiming at the carrier. The beam geometry indicated the fire control designation was oriented toward a bearing that encompassed the Super Hornet's position at 15,000 feet. The lead frigate's fire control radar was conducting a target designation activity on the F/A-18F section. The EW officer reported it to the commander at 7:34 a.m., using precise, technical language that did not editorialize and did not need to. Commanding Officer, EW. Lead, Type 054A, has fire control radar in target designation mode, bearing consistent with our CAP section. Assess as deliberate targeting activity, not search. The commander had 30 seconds to decide what the existence of that information meant for his next action. The fire control designation was not a weapons launch. It was not a weapons employment preparation in the legal sense that his rules of engagement addressed. It was an active, hostile radar activity directed at American military aircraft operating in international airspace. A provocation calibrated to be below the threshold that would authorize a kinetic response while being unambiguously above the threshold of routine surveillance. It was a message in radar pulses, and the message was, "We can do this." He transmitted to the KP section at 7:34 a.m. and 31 seconds. Devil section, strike. Lead frigate has a fire control designation on your position. Break right, descend to 8,000, maintain visual on both surface contacts. Do not approach within 8 nautical miles of either frigate. The Super Hornets executed the repositioning immediately. The maneuver took them out of the optimal geometric position that the commander had placed them in at 7:25 a.m. and into a position that was less tactically useful, but that removed them from the specific threat geometry that the fire control designation represented. At 7:35 a.m., the lead frigate's fire control radar returned to search mode. The commander noted the timeline. The fire control designation had been active for approximately 90 seconds, encompassing the period from its initiation through the CAP section's repositioning. The frigate had stopped the activity when the aircraft moved. The timeline was consistent with a deliberate demonstration, showing a capability, observing the response, and withdrawing the provocation once the response had been documented. The operation had generated exactly the information its planners had designed it to generate: a documented American defensive response to a plan fire control designation, establishing a behavioral baseline for future reference. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, positioned 2 miles off the carrier's port beam, had been tracking both frigates throughout the engagement with its own SPY-1D radar and had its standard missile fire control system in a standby posture that could transition to active engagement preparation in under 20 seconds. The destroyer's commanding officer had been in continuous communication with the strike group commander since 7:22 a.m. and had received no engagement authorization, and had not expected one. His ship's role in this engagement was presence, readiness, and deterrence in that order. At 7:41 a.m., the strike group was at 22 minutes from the frigate's blocking position. The Type 052D destroyer to the northeast was at 28 nautical miles, still closing. The planned formation geometry was tightening. The Channel 16 frequency, which had been silent since the initial exchange at 7:23 a.m., remained silent. Nobody on either side had anything to add to what the ship's positions were already saying. At 7:44 a.m., the lead frigate altered course, south. The turn was gradual and wide, the kind executed by a ship that is not fleeing and is not conceding, but is changing its position for reasons that its crew would characterize, in any subsequent account, as a routine navigational decision taken in accordance with good seamanship and international collision regulations. The wing frigate followed 12 seconds later, matching the turn with the same deliberate, unhurried precision it had matched every previous maneuver. Both ships reduced speed simultaneously to 16 knots as they steadied on their new southerly heading, which would carry them along a track parallel to the strike group's course line at a distance that would increase from 11.3 nautical miles to approximately 18 nautical miles over the next 40 minutes. They were not leaving. They were repositioning. The difference mattered operationally and symbolically, and everyone on both sides of the engagement understood the difference precisely. The strike group's course line was open. The commander maintained the strike group's heading and speed and transmitted a brief status report to CENTCOM at 7:46 a.m. He noted the frigate's repositioning, the current position of the Type 052D, the fire control designation event and its timeline, and the current status of all defensive systems. The report was factual and complete. It did not contain any interpretation of plan intent beyond what was directly observable from behavior, because observable behavior was sufficient, and interpretation beyond observation was a different community's responsibility. The strike group passed through the position where the frigates had been at 7:56 a.m. There was nothing at that position when the carrier reached it except open water and the radar returns of the two frigates now 18 nautical miles to the south, moving parallel to the course line at a distance that maintained contact without maintaining confrontation. The Type 052D had reduced speed at 7:49 a.m. and altered course to the east, not withdrawing, but repositioning to a trailing position relative to the strike group rather than the flanking encirclement geometry it had been building toward. The three-point geometric formation had not been completed. The carrier had passed through the intended blocking position before the third element of the formation reached its designed station. The distance between completing the formation and not completing it was approximately 14 minutes at the Type 052D's last observed speed. 14 minutes that represented the interval between the frigates initiating their southerly turn at 7:44 a.m. and the moment when the destroyer's encirclement position would have closed. Whether the planned command had always intended to release the blocking position before the geometry became irrevocable, or whether something in the engagement's development, the CAP section repositioning, the CEC activation, the Arleigh-Burke's fire control standby posture, some communication in a command channel that American intelligence had not intercepted, had produced the decision to stand down, the intelligence assessment did not resolve. What it resolved was the outcome. The strike group had maintained its course and completed its freedom of navigation transit. The plan formation had established a blocking position, demonstrated a fire control designation capability, collected a documented American defensive response, and repositioned before the geometry required a decision that neither side had been authorized to make. The accounting was conducted in the Combat Direction Center at 8:30 a.m. No ordnance expended, no systems damaged, no personnel casualties on either side, one freedom of navigation transit completed, one planned fire control designation documented, timed, and transmitted to theater intelligence, one Type 052 de-encirclement geometry partially executed and then withdrawn. One behavioral baseline established for planned surface group response to carrier transit under these conditions. A baseline that would be analyzed, modeled, and incorporated into the pre-mission intelligence packages for every subsequent strike group entering the South China Sea. The most consequential item in the accounting was the one that did not appear as a line in any expenditure ledger. The planned formation had executed a blocking maneuver in international waters in direct response to a lawful freedom of navigation operation, and had conducted a fire control designation of American military aircraft in international airspace. Both events were documented, transmitted, and would be raised through diplomatic channels in language that was formal, precise, and would produce a response that was also formal and precise and would resolve nothing that the ship's positions had not already established. The South China Sea is not a legal problem. It is a presence problem, and presence is resolved by presence at 18 knots on a course that does not alter for a blocking position that does not have the authority of international law behind it. The course was maintained. The transit was completed. The water was the same water it had always been, indifferent to the flags of the ships that passed through it, and indifferent to the claims that had been made in its name by people who had never asked its permission. The line in these waters is not drawn on any chart. It is drawn by the ships that sail it, every time they sail it, at whatever cost the day requires. Today, the cost was 34 minutes of heightened defensive readiness, one CAP repositioning maneuver, and 14 minutes of encirclement geometry that did not close. Tomorrow, the cost will be whatever it is. The course will not change. That is what it means to hold the line in water that does not belong to anyone who claims it.